Hello everyone, I'm Jacob Kauf and I'm the nerd on the screen, and today we're taking a look at the Deb822 configuration format. Alright guys, so if you use a Linux distribution that is based on Debian or Ubuntu, you're hopefully familiar with the command line usage and configuration of the package manager apt. Now, if you're not familiar with that, then there are two videos that you might want to check out. One of them is my video about package management on Debian and Ubuntu-based Linux distributions. I talk about command line usage of dpackage and apt in that video. And then the other one is a video about how to upgrade an Ubuntu-based Linux distribution from one release version to the next. And in that video, I talk about how to edit your sources.list file manually to change the version of Ubuntu that your package manager is going to install for you. Now, today what I'm talking about is a new format that you can use for that configuration file. In the world of Debian and Ubuntu, you have probably seen these lines. Some people call them Deb lines, and these are lines of configuration that tell your package manager where to get software from. These are repositories of software that your package manager is going to get an index from so it knows what's available. And then when you actually go to install software, it's going to look in these places to get the software that you're installing. Now, if you've been using those distributions for a long time, it might surprise you to learn that there's a new way you can format your sources.list files that does not have any of these deadlines in them. And it's really interesting because it's both more human readable and more machine readable. So far, I only know of one Linux distribution that's using this new format by default, and that's Pop! OS. Pop! OS changed its system sources to use the new Deb822 configuration format instead of the old format, starting with version 20.10. Vanilla Ubuntu and most of the other distributions that I know of that are based on Ubuntu are still using the old format right now. But since Pop! OS has been the first one to change over, what I'm going to do today is show you the old format and the new format side by side and kind of explain how the new format works, why people are changing to it, because I know a lot of people in Linux land don't like change, but it's not as scary when you actually understand the new format. So we're going to take a look at it. We'll take a look at the pros and cons and show you how what you used to know for how to configure Ubuntu and Debian-based distributions now maps to the new way of doing things for distributions that are using it. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and cut to the desktop. Alright guys, so here we are on the desktop, and right now I've got a Pop! OS 20.04 machine and a Pop! OS 20.10 machine. I've gone ahead and changed the wallpaper on the 20.04 machine just to differentiate them a little bit, so this is the older version and this is the newer version. So let's go ahead and open up a terminal on both of these machines and take a look at the configuration that we have on each of them. The first thing I'm going to do is run a sudo apt update just to see what we have right now, what we have configured. So over on the left, I ran a sudo apt update. You can see we are going to the Ubuntu archive because this is an Ubuntu-based distribution. Now for the Ubuntu repository, we've got the Focal suite, Focal being the code name for 20.04. And then we also have some other suites. We've got the Focal Security Suite, Focal Update Suite, and Focal Backport Suite. So these are several different groups of software, and that's why we've got several different lines checking the same URL, because when we go to this URL the first time, we're only checking for the base Focal software. That was stuff that was published when 20.04 was released back in April of this year. Since then, there have been updates, and so Focal Security is going to be important security updates that are generally going to always be retrieved from Ubuntu directly rather than from a mirror. That allows them to get the important security fixes out a little quicker. And then we've got Focal Updates. That's the less critical bug fix updates that have been released. And then Focal Backports are going to be newer versions of software and just newer software in general that's been released after 20.04 was already out, and it's being brought back to 20.04 via this additional suite. Now, in addition to those, we've got the two repositories that make this Pop! OS, which would be the System76 PPA that's hosted on Launchpad, and that's going to have most of the Pop! OS software on it. And then we've also got the Pop! OS proprietary repository, which is where System76 packages a couple of third-party programs as a courtesy. So those are the repositories on this system. If I install a piece of software with sudo apt install, it is going to come from one of these places. So let's come over to our newer version and run the same command, sudo apt update. And when we run that, we will see we get the same 6 hits. Once again, we've got Groovy being the codename for 20.10, so the suite names are all going to be different. but we've still got the base suite for this version. We've got security updates and backports all coming from the Ubuntu repository. We've got the System76 PPA, and then we've got apt.popos.org as well. So let's take a look at where all of these are actually configured, because of course we can install software from wherever we want to, or we can not install software from wherever we want to. If we don't want any backports, we can take this suite away, for example. So let's look at where those are actually configured. I'm going to go ahead and cat out our etc apt sources.list file on 20.04. I am going to make the terminal a bit bigger here so it doesn't wrap. And this is what sources.list looks like on a Pop! OS system. Slight disclaimer, I did move the apt.popos.org/proprietary repository out of this main sources.list file, and I moved it into its own file inside of sources.list.d. The reason I did that is because that's the default setup in 20.10, and it's going to make it a little bit easier to compare these two when the file structure is the same at least. So this is just the Ubuntu repositories that we have in our main sources.list file. And then if I do an ls on etc apt sources.list.d, you can see we've got our Pop! OS apps.list. That's where that proprietary repository is configured. And then we've also got System76 Ubuntu pop focal.list. That is where our PPA is configured. So that is where everything is coming from here. You can see for the Ubuntu repository, we've got our deb line here for focal. So that's where the focal suite comes from. And then we've got a line for focal security. That's where the focal security one comes from. We've got focal updates and then focal backports. So each of those different suites has its own line in this file. And then all of those lines are also duplicated because they all have source code available as well. And apt is configured to fetch source code if you tell it to from any of these places. So each one has a deb line and also a almost identical deb source line. So you should be used to this. If you're using Ubuntu, hopefully you're used to this. If you're not, this is how things used to be configured. Now let's take a look over on 20.10. I'm going to once again make our terminal a little bit bigger so that that doesn't wrap, and let's take a look at what's inside of our main etc apt sources.list file. And this is actually pretty neat because there's nothing in this file. And this is something that might scare some people. Like I said, if you've been using Ubuntu or Debian for a long time, how can you have nothing in your main sources.list file? And that part's pretty simple. It's because all of our configuration is now going to be done inside of sources.list.d instead of the main sources.list file. And there's a reason for that. It has to do with the file extension .list. .list is going to imply this old type of configuration. And the new one is .sources. So let's take a look. Let's do an ls at etc apt sources.list.d, and let's see what we have in here. And by the way, there is, you can see commented out at the top of our sources.list file on 20.04. This is a line telling apt that it could get software from the CD-ROM, aka the USB drive more realistically. And that is used when you're actually installing the operating system. Now it's commented out at this point because I no longer have that USB drive inserted, or in this case I'm in VirtualBox, I no longer have the virtual CD inserted. So that's commented out during installation, and that's normal. And you can see we do still have that default commented out CD-ROM over here in our main sources.list file as well, but since it's got that hash mark at the beginning, neither of those lines are doing anything. Now in sources.list.d, we've got Pop! OS apps.sources now instead of .list. And then we've got System76 Ubuntu pop groovy.list, which corresponds with our focal.list over here. And this .list.save over here, this is just an automated thing. When an update was installed, it made a backup of this .list file. Apt is going to ignore anything that's not ending in .list or .sources. So this .save file doesn't matter either. But we do have an additional file over in 20.10 that we don't have in 20.04. That is our system.sources file. This is going to be where the Ubuntu configuration is for apt. So let's take a look inside of that. We'll cat out etc apt sources.list.d/system.sources. And what do we have inside of here? This is the Deb822 file format. And by the way, it's called Deb822 because the standard was introduced in a request for comment document RFC 822 for Debian. So that's where the 822 name comes from. But this is what the new configuration format looks like. Like I said, in my opinion, it's more human readable. And in the opinions of some software developers, it's also more machine readable. So it's interesting because it's got two positives and no negatives when you think about it that way. Now let's take a look here and compare what we have inside of our old file with the new file. Once again, this is only going to be our base Ubuntu repositories. Mapping this old file to the new file to see where that information has gone, you can see we had our URIs, the actual links to where that software is being downloaded from. And in the old format, that was on every single one of these lines, because each deb line, you were specifying whether this was a deb or a deb source configuration, and then you had your URI, so where it's actually going to fetch from. Then you had your suite, and then you had a number of components. So over here in our new configuration format, the URI, we only have that stated in here once. Now, just from that, you can already tell that this is a more efficient way to format your configuration. Because instead of having to duplicate that text between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different lines, it's now in here a single time. It's actually stated down here as well a second time, but this is a special line that's not part of the Deb822 format, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But as far as what you need to have to make this work, you only have to have that URI stated in here once. So much less repetitive, and if you want to change it, that's less work for you. Because instead of having to change this, let's say that you are in the UK and not the US, but you installed Ubuntu or Pop! OS, and you selected United States as your locale during installation, but now you want to change it because maybe you moved to the UK and you want to have those local mirrors that are going to give you faster download speeds. In the old file, you have to go through and modify every single one of these lines. And I've had to sit there on phone calls with people and walk them through changing these lines sometimes. And when there's more for you to change, even if you're changing the same thing on every line, the more that you have to do as a human, there's a greater chance that you're going to screw something up. You're going to make a typo in one of these many lines. Whereas when it's only stated once, and you only have to change it once, it's simpler, it's quicker, and it's easier. So that's great. Now over here in our old file, like I said, we had our Focal suite, and that's the base software that was the Focal release in April. And then we've got our Focal security suite, our updates, and our backport suites. Each one of these needed its own separate line that is very long and has lots of things around it. Here in Deb822, we've just got a suites line, and we can list all the suites that we want. So let's say that I wanted to remove backports from my system. Let's say I don't want any backports. Let's say I'm using this version of Pop! OS because I wanted the software that was released with that version. I don't want anything that's newer. So in the case of the old file, I would have to open this up in a text editor, and I would have to remove this entire line. Plus, I'd probably also want to remove the entire line underneath it that is also backports. That's the deb source line for that suite. In the new file, I only have to remove groovy-backports right here. So I'm removing a single word instead of 2 lines when I want to make that particular change. Once again, quicker, easier, more efficient. Then we've got components. Now components are interesting. I kind of skipped over those earlier because components aren't shown when you're fetching with apt. But the components are going to separate out the software in each of these suites into different categories. You've got your main category, that is free and open source software that Canonical themselves, the creators of Ubuntu, are supporting. Then you've got restricted. That's going to be proprietary drivers and important components that you kind of need to ship, but they are not free and open source, so they go into their own component. You've got Universe, and that's going to be free and open source software that is community maintained, so Canonical themselves are not implying any sort of support for this software, but since it's free and open source, people want to have it, it's fairly safe to host it, and so that goes into the Universe suite. And then Multiverse, that's software that's restricted by copyright or legal issues. So similar to restricted, Multiverse is not free or open source. Typically, it's going to be less important. Restricted, like I said, more for drivers. Multiverse is more for applications that people might want, but some people might not want. So that goes into Multiverse. And the Wikipedia page for Ubuntu actually has a table that sums that up nicely. Main is free software that's Canonical supported, restricted is non-free and Canonical supported, Universe is free software that's unsupported, Multiverse is non-free that's unsupported. So that's why there are 4 different components configured by default on an Ubuntu-based system. Now during installation of vanilla Ubuntu, you might have a checkbox to include restricted drivers or not include restricted drivers, and that would probably toggle restricted restricted and possibly multiverse on and off in the installer. But once again, when we're looking at the configuration once we've installed, the system does exist now. Let's say we wanted to change it. Let's say that I am on a Libre kick and I don't want any proprietary software on this machine. In that case, I would want to remove the restricted and multiverse components because those components, they contain non-free software. So back here with the old configuration format, once again, I would have to remove restricted and multiverse from this line, and then I would have to do the same thing on the next line and the next line. I would have to remove those 2 words from all 8 of these lines. So that's 16 words I have to remove just to get 2 components off of my system. With the new format, I only have to remove those components once here on the components line. And that does bring up a potential concern. What if you want to have these components enabled for some of these suites, but not for others? You know, in the new format, since everything's combined, it's not possible to have restricted turned on for Groovy, but off for Groovy updates, whereas that is possible to configure here with the old format. And my response to that would be, it's not actually very useful to be able to do that. And here's why. The suites are typically going to be used, like I said, for updates. This is stuff that's coming out after you installed the system. So you've got security updates, you've got bug fix updates. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say, I am okay with having proprietary software that was released in April, but I don't want updates to that proprietary software. On the contrary, since proprietary software is fairly insecure in that you can't see the issues with it, when updates are pushed out, if you trusted that software enough to install it in the first place, you're probably going to want to install those fixes because they could be important and you don't really know because it's proprietary. So there's not really any situation where you would want to have one of these components enabled for one suite but not for another suite. If you really wanted to, you could always roll back your configuration file to the old format, or you could make multiple of these .sources files, some with some suites and some with other suites. But for the majority of users, this is simpler and easier. And then we've also got types. As you can see, like I said over here, every single one of these suites has to have a deb line and a deb source line. We are duplicating so much text. And it's text, so it's small. It's not like anybody was complaining about these few bytes on their hard drive or SSD being taken up. But it's more that you have to worry about. It's more that you have to copy and paste or modify if you are going through and editing your configuration for some reason. So if you wanted to turn source code fetching off, let's say that you don't actually use the source code for these repositories, you never build packages from scratch on your system anyway, so you just don't want to have it enabled, you don't want to use the bandwidth to get the metadata and that kind of thing. In the new format, all you have to do is take deb source out of types, and you've just turned off the source code for all of these suites. Once again, much simpler and easier. Now going back to the components though, another reason why this new format makes more sense and is easier is because the components in the old format, that was the one thing that you didn't need to duplicate lines for, was components. You know, suites, you needed to separate out lines. Source code needed to be their own lines. Components, though, yes, they were duplicated on all of these lines. Every single one of these lines had to have all the components listed on them. But at least all the different components did not need their own lines, because how this old format worked was you started with the type of source that you're configuring, either deb or deb source. You follow it up with a URI, then you've got a space in your suite, and this was a space-delimited system. You know, you can't have spaces in URIs. You would have to put a %20 if somebody put a space in the URI for whatever reason. Because when you put a space, the computer says, okay, that's the next part of the line. So it was the type, space, URI, space, suite, space, and then the rest of the line was space-delimited components. Now, I mentioned a couple times already that the new system is also easier for machines to read, not just for humans to read. I think I've demonstrated fairly well in editing, you know, how the new format is easier for humans to work with. But why is the new format easier for computers to work with? Well, in this old format, you don't know how many components there are going to be. You can make a reasonable assumption that the components are going to be the same on every line in a file, but the specification says you've got your suite and then space, and then the rest of the words on the line are just components. So in this case, we've got 4, But if we took away all the proprietary stuff, then we'd be left with 2 components on each line. Even just in this file, you can see at the top we did have main and restricted, so the CD only had the canonical supported software on it. And so even though you can make a reasonable assumption that all of the components should be the same, in this case, we can't just say read the first line to find out what components are in this sources.list file, because the components can be different between different lines. The numbers of components can be different, and ultimately you don't know how long this line is going to be. You don't know how many pieces there are going to be to this line, which makes it a little more difficult to programmatically interact with when you don't know how long it's going to be. It's possible, yes, there are some tools out there that do it, but they do tend to be slow and sometimes buggy. And it's easier to do in this new system, because in the new system, the computer knows that the components line is always going to be filled with components. It doesn't have to figure out, okay, well, where does the suite stop and the components start, because it knows there's going to be a line that starts with the word components. It really spells it out there for whatever program is parsing this. So even though, once again, you can take some words out of here and this particular line is going to change its length, the number of lines in here is going to remain consistent. Now, the Deb822 format is nice in that it doesn't just require you to only use the lines that it specifies. We've got an enabled line for turning things on and off. Instead of having to put a pound sign in front of every single one of these lines, we can just change yes to no to turn this entire file off. But in addition to all of these lines that are specified in the Deb822 format, we've also got some of these additional lines. You can see they say X repo lib, and we've got a name up here, and then we've also got a default mirror. So these are additional features that Pop! OS includes. And if you have a vanilla Ubuntu installation, you can use these built-in standard lines. But these additional lines just won't really do anything because they're not lines that apt is going to be looking for. In this case, it's a library called repo-lib that is used by a GUI tool called repo-man, which I'm actually going to open up here. So I'm going to open up the pop shop and just click the gear to open repo-man. And I'm going to do the same thing over on 20.04, once again, just to visually demonstrate how this differs when you're editing things, because not everyone uses configuration files, so you might wonder why you should even care about any of this if you're someone who only uses the GUI. All right, so we've got repo-man open on both of these systems. Now, just to show what I was showing before, let's say that you want to take all of the non-free software off of your system. So I'm going to uncheck the restricted and multiverse boxes here. And I'm going to uncheck the first one, put in my password, then I'll uncheck the second one. And if we take a look at our sources.list file, once again, all those different lines changed. Whereas the new one, if I want to do the same thing, I'll turn restricted and multiverse off. And you notice there's no on and off button for main over here because you'd be turning off all of your software if you did that. So not really much point to doing it. But if we take a look at our configuration file over here, once again, much less has changed. It's just the components on the components line have been updated and we can put them back very easily. If we go to our updates tab, once again, if I uncheck, let's say I don't want any backports, that is going to take 2 lines out of that file, and I can uncheck all of the additional software and just leave our main suite, and now we've just got 2 lines of configuration, and I can put them all back, and they all go back, so that works okay. Now you can see, interesting. Oh, it didn't put the source lines back. Okay, so repo-man used to be built on top of a library called Software Properties Common, which was the same library that Ubuntu themselves used for their GUI programs. So this is an example of a bug. I would consider this a bug. So we had source code configured for all of our suites before, and after unchecking those checkboxes and then checking them again, in the GUI, we have restored this to exactly the same configuration it was before we started. We unchecked a box, we checked the box again. It should look the same as it did before we started working with it. But in this case, you can see the deb source lines for these 3 additional suites were not added back to the file. So if you tried to grab the source code for one of those via apt, it's not going to be able to get source code for any packages in these suites. Because it doesn't have the deb source line for those. That's a bug in Software Properties Common, I would assume. In the new system, it's easier because if we turn all of these off, all of these different additional suites and we take a look once again at our configuration file, so we've got all our components back again, but our suites, we've just now got the one Groovy suite. And if we turn these all back on, the way that it messed up before, not putting those deb source lines in, that's no longer possible to do with this new system, because all that it has to do is add those suites to the suites line. Because the source code is not controlled by additional lines that are suite specific, the source code is controlled by the types line. And this deb source, it never went away. You know, even when we turned those suites off, deb source was still turned on, and it's still turned on here. So all 4 of these suites are going to have source code turned on. So it's simpler. And it's harder to screw up, you know. Now, if we look in our developer options here, I don't know, did we have developer options? Over here we did. So let's try unchecking source code on the old one, and now we don't have any deb source lines. If I check it again, yes, it adds all of the deb source lines back, and then you can see we've got messy added by software properties comments at the end of all those lines. And that's another thing. Look at this. So in terms of machine readability, I told you that, oh, okay, we've got our type, URI, suite, and then the rest of the line is components. So it's like, what's the big deal? You know, just parse it from left to right and then just keep parsing components until you get a new line. Well, this is an example where now we've got comments. So this is an additional word, this is an additional word, this is an additional word, and only one of these words has a hash mark in it. So if your software is parsing this file, it needs to be smart enough to know once it hits a word with a hash mark, it needs to ignore all following words as well, because these following words don't have hash marks on them, but they're still space delimited, just like our actual pieces of the line are here. The new system avoids all of that complexity. And if we turn source code off on the new system, it's very easy because it just takes away the deb source from that types. It doesn't have to remove 4 different lines. We can turn it back on, decides it needs to authenticate me again, and there we have it again. Now, in terms of these extra features, let's take a look at our extra sources tab. This is where additional software that you're adding, so PPAs, repositories for third-party programs, this is where that stuff is configured. Now for this, I'm going to use the proprietary repository as an example. And the reason I'm doing that is because System76 right now in Pop! OS 20.10, if we take a look at apt sources.list.d / system76 ubuntu pop groovy.list, it's still using the old format. What they're doing is they're keeping it on the old format because it's a PPA in particular, and they know that users are used to PPAs and are probably going to be following guides online on how to add PPAs. So there's actually some scripts that run when certain packages get updated that will convert some repositories over to the new Deb822 format, but it's not going to do that for PPAs. If somebody adds a PPA, they're probably going to want that line to stay in their configuration the way they added it. So they haven't moved these over to the new format yet, but Pop! OS apps.sources, you can see here, we've got our new Deb822 configuration format. And then if we take a look at sources.list.d / Pop! OS apps.list, once again, this is not a default file on the old version, but I moved those lines out of the main file into their own file just to compare here. Now, in this case, it appears that we have more lines of configuration. In terms of the main file, this was actually a much shorter sources.list file in terms of lines and in terms of words, because we don't have to duplicate all that information. But when we're just adding a simple repository, we've got 2 lines over here, and we've got 6 lines over here. So that is more lines. Once again, though, it's easier to read and work with. Let's go back here and let's edit this proprietary source with the old version. So we've got a type drop-down box, which is interesting. So if we change the type to source code, is that going to remove that first line? No, it's going to change the type of the first line to deb source while not uncommenting the second line. So that's an interesting choice right there in terms of UX. And is this, oh, we're still, all right. So this is an example of the speed thing. So at this point, software properties common, that library that they were using, yeah, it couldn't add that source repository because it's a proprietary repo. There is no source. And we have to wait for software properties common, Ubuntu's library, to work through that. Wait for this spinner to stop spinning. In Pop! OS 20.10, they switched to their own library called repo-lib that is now backing up RepoMan, and it's much faster. Still waiting on software properties common over here. Boy, that is just taking its time. All right, well, we're going to leave that spinning. But over here in the new version with repo_lib and repo_man, we can turn source code on. And if we save that, it's just going to add deb source here. So once again, we avoid the confusion and the potential for bugs. You know, those are bugs that could be fixed, and those are UI and UX decisions that can be changed. But it just avoids all of it with the new system because it's so much simpler. We can turn source code back off once again because it is a proprietary repo and there is no source code for those apps. Now, what I also want to look at is adding additional URIs. And at this point, I'm just going to close repo_man, and I'm going to fix this file manually, sudo nano into that file. We'll just change that back to deb. And let's open repo_man back up over here. We've got to wait for the pop shop to update over here. And here we have repo_man open again. So let's go back to extra sources. So for apt.popos.org/proprietary, let's say there's an additional URI you want to add. And why would you want to do this? Well, there's a reason why distributions have many different mirrors. You know, in Ubuntu in particular, Pop!OS will actually always install with the us.archive.ubuntu.com mirror. And that's something that not everybody likes because not everyone is in the US. It makes it very easy for the Pop!OS developers and for their support staff when everybody always knows where software is coming from. It's always coming from the same servers. These are still canonical servers. These are not in control of the Pop!OS developers. But you're always going to have software released at the same time. You don't have to worry about mirrors syncing and things like that. However, some users, like I said, are in different countries and they want to use local mirrors. That's a common reason why you would change this from us.archive.ubuntu.com to, let's say, uk.archive.ubuntu.com, or for Australia, au.archive.ubuntu.com. But then there's also just different mirrors that you can use for the same country. You know, there are universities and things like that, and just companies that are donating space on their servers and donating bandwidth. And they're running mirrors that you can use if you want to download software from. And it's going to be identical software. You're going to be getting the same software, probably at around the same time, maybe a little delay with mirror syncing. But any Linux distribution really is going to have a network of mirrors that you can use if you want to. Now, there's a reason I'm showing you this using the Pop!OS apps.list file and not the main sources.list file. And that's because repo_man didn't even support doing this with the main file. With the old version, and it does with the new version. But taking a look at our repo first, let's say that this particular repository, it's less common for a third-party repository to have multiple mirrors, but let's say that it did. Let's say that I also want to add http://uk.apt.popos.org/proprietary. Once again, this isn't a real working URL, but let's just say that I want to add that. We're pretending that this is an additional mirror. And the reason I'm not just taking the first one away, let's say that I actually am in the US. But if this server goes down, I want to fall back to the second server. And we can do that by adding an additional URI. Now, when I do this with the old version of repo_man, I'm sure it's going to freeze again because it's going to not be able to contact that fake server. But you can see what this has done here. This has actually created invalid configuration. You can see couldn't add source, the repository does not have a release file. Okay, so this was not supported at all, I guess, with the old version of repo_man. The reason this configuration file is invalid is because, like I said, this configuration always has to be type, URI, suite, components optionally. And now we've got type, URI, we've got a space, and then this is not a valid suite. And then it's treating these as components, even though focal is not a component, this is not a suite, so this is just broken at this point. All right, so what I'm running into now is actually limitation of the software that I'm using to demonstrate, and not actually limitation of the format itself. So I'm gonna just show you how this works with the new version of repo_man that really is very slick because repo_lib that it depends on is also very slick. So I'll do the same thing. We're gonna add uk.apt.popos.org/proprietary. So if our US server goes down, we will fall back to the server across the pond. And so if we take a look at this, we've just got a space delimited line for URIs, and this is perfectly valid. and we can run a sudo apt update, it's going to fail to contact uk.apt.popos.org. It's going to say 404 not found because, once again, that doesn't actually exist, that subdomain. Looks like it just redirects to system76.com, which is not serving any packages. But in terms of configuration, the configuration is syntactically valid in this case. Now let's compare that to what happens if we do the same thing with the old format. So system76, so this is our Launchpad PPA. So once again, still using the old format for the Launchpad PPA. What if we want to add a second mirror for a repository that's using the old format? Once again, I'm going to put a space, http://. I'm just going to use the same fake example, uk.apt.popos.org/proprietary. Actually, I'll just say /free since this is the PPA that's hosting mostly open source stuff. So I'm going to click save on that. And RepoMan, I knew for a fact before I started this video that in 20.10 RepoMan does that properly. And here's what it looks like when you add an additional mirror, an additional URI using the old format. Take a look at that. We have just doubled. We can ignore the first 3 lines that are just comments, but in terms of substantial lines, we have doubled the number of lines in here because there is no way to have multiple URIs in a single configuration line with this old format. There is no way to do it because it's space delimited, and you know, if we were able to have more than one URI or more than one suite on a line, then we wouldn't know where to start counting our components. It's very important that the 4th word is always the component, and anything after that is additional components. So just like how we have to have separate lines for all our different suites in the old format, we also had to have separate lines for all of our different URIs. Whereas, as you already saw, the new format, we don't have to double the number of lines in that file. It's the same number of lines when we change the URIs in one of these new style ones. It's just, it adds it to the URIs line, which is space delimited. So that's great. And then you can see we do have this xrepo_lib name thing in the old file, but it's commented out, whereas the xrepo_lib name in PopOS apps.sources doesn't have to be commented out, because with Deb822, apt is only going to look at the lines that it's expecting anyway. So if there are other lines that it's not expecting, you don't have to comment them out, because it's just going to ignore them anyway. So what is that about, xrepo_lib name? Like I said, that's a PopOS specific feature. Here in RepoMan, we've got a name, PopOS applications, and let's say I want to make this a little bit more accurate, because there are a lot of PopOS applications that are shipped in that PPA, and this isn't stuff that System76 is developing in this repo. This is proprietary third-party applications. So I'm going to rename this source to proprietary applications. I'll click save, and you can see RepoMan updates right away. There's no little spinner going here. Once again, repo_lib is much more nimble than software properties common. And then RepoMan, as a GUI application, can actually use its own entry in this new format of configuration. So it's using this line to store that information for itself. It's repo_lib that's doing it, not RepoMan, the GUI front end. But my point is that the people building tools on top of this new format, not only is it easier for humans to work with, but it's nicer and easier for machines to work with as well. Once again, there is a name field here in the old one, and I can rename that to PopOS Launchpad PPA. I'll click save. And then if we take a look at our Launchpad, so that changed the comment in here. But let's say that I go into this old style document, and let's say that I just add another line. I'm curious if that's going to mess anything up. So I've added another line. We'll click edit here. So it still knows that that's called Launchpad PPA. What if I add another hash mark in front of it? I'm going to edit it one more time just to see if it's still handling that okay. Yeah, all right, so it's able to deal with that, but it's doing it in comments, once again, instead of just being able to add its own fields. So yeah, now coming back to the main page, there is one new feature in PopOS 20.10 with RepoMan that was not even in 20.04 at all, and that is the ability to add new mirrors. And this was something that users requested because people are living in different countries and they want mirrors that are close to them, and that's valid. And so we've got this nice slick system that, if we go back to our system.sources list here, we've got our URIs line, and just like how we can do it for additional repositories, I can add http://uk.archive.ubuntu.com/ubuntu. And I'm going to add that one. I think I left an invalid, oh no, I fixed that. Yeah, looks like everything should be valid at this point. So I've added an additional mirror, and just to show you guys, that is actually a real mirror, that UK Ubuntu mirror. I can run a sudo apt update, and you can see I'm now fetching from us.archive.ubuntu.com, but I'm also getting a whole lot more stuff since this is the first time I've contacted this new mirror from uk.archive.ubuntu.com. And it's going a little bit slower since it is so geographically far from me. We'll wait for that to finish. All right. And all packages are still up to date since that's just a mirror, so it's not going to have newer packages than the US server. So that's how it works with the new format, adding mirrors. However, there was a concern when implementing this, and it was a concern that I was actually kind of in on, and that is the concern that users might mess things up. Crazy, right? If somebody is going in and editing their configuration files by hand, then we have to assume that they at least know what they're doing a little bit, and if they don't, then they'll know they were the one who screwed it up, and they won't try and blame the system on it. But if we're going to be giving people a GUI to change mirrors, what happens if somebody does this? What happens if somebody adds a mirror that's invalid? It's syntactically valid, which is why RepoMan will let me add it. Because what if you theoretically wanted to add a mirror that's offline right now, but is going to be online in a day, and you know that it's offline right now, you want to add it anyway, so fine, we'll let you add invalid mirrors. We'll also let you delete the defaults. So I've just added a couple of mirrors that don't do anything. Let's take a look at our file right now. These are fake mirrors. These aren't even proper domains. I would have to have a DNS entry on this computer, I think, or maybe on my local network if I wanted to resolve those, but I don't. So if we do a sudo apt update, we're getting all kinds of errors. Failure to resolve, failed to fetch. And let's say that somebody just tried to copy and paste off of, they just Googled, they heard about this thing called mirrors, and they said, oh, I want a local mirror, so this moves faster. And they Googled it, and they tried to copy and paste a mirror in, but maybe they copied and pasted wrong. They didn't catch the entire URL, they left a letter off, and now they're getting all kinds of errors. Well, the nice thing here, we've also got an xrepo_lib default mirror entry that, as you can see, it has not changed this whole time. Once again, a user could go in here and change this manually, which would screw things up if they did that, but assuming they're going through the GUI because they ostensibly don't know what they're doing if they made the mistake in the first place. And everything I'm saying is my personal opinion in this video, I want to be very clear. But this is really cool in my personal opinion because we've got a default mirror entry that if somebody screws something up and they phone up, a friend or some company's support department to try and help them with it, there's a nice red button here that says reset mirrors to defaults. If we click that, enter our password again, and repo_lib, when we do that reset, is going to copy whatever is in this default mirror field. It's going to copy it up to the URIs field. And so now that is back to normal. We can do a sudo apt update, and hey, look at that. We're not getting any error messages anymore. So that's another example of being able to use additional fields in the configuration format. Since it is now line delimited information, each line is a different type of information, rather than space delimited like before. Theoretically, this default mirror thing, maybe it could have been accomplished using a comment, kind of like how the names were also accomplished using comments for the old format, but it would have been more prone to breakage. It would have been harder to read, harder to write. This is much simpler for everybody involved. And it's one of those things that's a win all around. Like, I can't think of any downsides to this other than people are gonna need to kind of learn a new system. In my opinion, it's fairly straightforward. If you open this file up, you should kind of, it's labeled, you're gonna know what each of these lines is for. So it's not hard to learn, unlike this old system that, yes, I knew what each of these different pieces meant, but a lot of users didn't. So this new way, it's simpler, and it doesn't restrict you really in any material way. Like I said, the only type of restriction you could have is, I mean, let's say you wanted the source code turned on for the security suite, but not for the other three. And then you could just copy this system.sources file to a system-security.sources, take security and deb source out of this main file and add only the security suite to the new file and have deb source turned on. So there are ways to work around the few very, very corner cases where it might be more complicated to do something with this new format. But in general, the new format, it makes things easier for users, for humans who are editing configuration files. It makes life a lot easier for users who are relying on GUIs. The GUI is a lot more reliable, less buggy, faster. So no matter what type of user you are, this new configuration format, it benefits you. And so that's why I wanted to make this video, because I honestly thought this was neat. I don't even use an Ubuntu-based distribution. You know, on my primary system here, the one that I'm recording this on, my personal system is still Arch Linux. So none of what I've talked about today is on my personal system. But if you do use an Ubuntu-based system on your personal computer, then you can, I mean, if you want to, regular Ubuntu works with this new format already. You can go and you can replace your sources.list. You know, you want to make sure you catch everything. Make sure you don't miss anything when you're moving things over, but you can go and change your sources manually if you wanted to be in this new format. The Ubuntu GUI with Software Properties Common doesn't handle the new format, I don't think. But yeah, some distributions like Pop! OS are already implementing it, and you will probably be seeing more of it in the future. I would expect that Ubuntu and the people maintaining Ubuntu's GUIs would eventually see some of the same benefits that System76 was seeing with RepoMan. And so I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know what's going on in Canonical, but I wouldn't be surprised if a year or two down the line you start seeing regular Ubuntu ship with Deb822. And it works on Debian too, not just Ubuntu-based distributions. So especially if you're using Debian on servers where you don't even have a GUI installed at all, then that might be a great opportunity to try using this new format. Next time you go to add a repo, you know, you can try it out. So if you are one of those users who would have been scared by this change or annoyed or upset by it, I hope this video has explained what the new format is and how it's a little bit easier, how it conveys all the same information just in ways that are easier to read and work with. If you're like me and you don't even use Ubuntu or Debian-based distributions on a regular basis, my servers are running on Debian, to be fair. But you know, even if you're not affected by this immediately, maybe you still thought it was cool to see the new format. I hope this was at least a little interesting for you. If you want more content about Linux, feel free to support me at nerdclub.nonce.co. But for now, that's everything I had to talk about. So I'm Jacob Kaufman, I'm the Nerd on the Street, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.